Men are leaving dating behind. It didn't happen all at once. No one announced it. It wasn't a trend or a viral philosophy. It was more like a collective sigh. After years of quiet exhaustion, they're no longer where they used to be. Not in cafes, pretending to care. Not in bars, waiting to be noticed. Not on screens, swiping endlessly, hoping for a spark they stopped believing in. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't some rebellion against women or love itself. It was something quieter, more intimate, deeper. It was fatigue. The kind that doesn't live in the muscles, but in the soul. It settles slowly, like a fog creeping in under the door, until everything is covered. Tired of waiting, tired of being ignored, tired of giving everything, and getting barely a glance in return, of playing a game where the rules change weekly and still being expected to win. Many tried honestly, with flowers, with words, with patience, with healing, with purpose, with well-written profiles and carefully timed replies. And still, what they gave disappeared into a bottomless well. Until one day, they stopped throwing the rope, stopped shouting into the void, and simply sat down, quietly, facing themselves. At first, the loneliness stung, not because they were alone, but because they realized how long they had been running. From that moment, all that effort, all those gestures, all that energy directed outward, it hadn't come from a desire to share, but from a fear of being alone. But when the noise fell away, when the search went still, when they finally stopped running, they began to hear something else. A soft sound, ancient, not from the world, but from within. The voice of the one they had abandoned, their quieter self, more honest, more alive. Some stopped sending messages that no one read. Others grew tired of small talk with no soul. And a few simply stopped moving. They stayed still, in silence, like someone returning home after a storm. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't defeat. It was rest. The kind of rest that only arrives when you finally let go of what you were never meant to carry. And it was there, in that quiet no one else could hear, that something unexpected began to happen. There was no anxiety, no need to impress, no urgency to be seen. There was presence, stillness, a kind of being that had no need for performance, and without even noticing, they began to become magnetic, but not like before. Not for what they showed, but for what they no longer needed to prove. They weren't chasing love anymore, and so love began to move toward them. It didn't come fast, or flashy, or like in the movies. It came slow, like all things worth waiting for. The kind of love that asks for no attention, that doesn't explode, but lingers, a cup placed gently on a table, a look that doesn't need words, a hand offered without demand, not idealized love, not romanticized, but something more real, slower, quieter. A love that didn't need to be conquered, or seduced, or chased. A love that arrived only when the one who once searched no longer needed to be rescued. Because sometimes, when the urge to find fades, when need is no longer the engine, when no one is shouting, "Love me," the soul becomes visible. And when it does, something else recognizes it, not for its beauty, not for its charm, but for its peace. And that's when many of them finally understood real love isn't chased, it isn't earned, it isn't forced, it's found only when you become findable, when you dwell within yourself, when you heal unseen, when you walk alone and no longer feel lost. The man who leaves dating He's not isolating. He's not closing off. He's not becoming bitter. He's just shifting gravity. It's no longer about her, no longer about romance, no longer about the dream of us. It's about him, his time, his calm, his clear gaze, his feet on the ground, his hands empty yet steady. And with that, with nothing more, life begins to bring toward him what used to run away. Maybe love was never far. Maybe it was always waiting for him to stop chasing. Because not everything that runs needs to be followed, and not everything that's found was ever truly sought. There was a time when dating was sacred, not perfect, not always smooth, but sacred in the way quiet things are. Unrushed, felt, not optimized, not gamified. People walked side by side, looked into each other's eyes, laughed without filters, touched without scorekeeping. Love had the rhythm of breath, of footsteps, of two voices learning how to share a silence. Then came the noise. It arrived quietly, with speed, with convenience, with choice. At first, it looked like freedom, a way to meet more people, faster, to find the one with just a few swipes, to match before saying a word. But freedom without depth becomes distraction, and choice without meaning becomes chaos. Now, dating is a transaction, a swipe economy, a market of illusions. Photos filtered to perfection, captions engineered for effect, conversations that begin with strategy and end in silence. He enters the app, he scrolls. Hundreds of faces, all beautiful, all curated, all looking, but no one really seeing. He sends a message, polite, curious. He waits, nothing, or worse, a reply that says everything and nothing. How's your day? LOL. IDK? Cool. Words that fill space but never build bridges. So he tries again. Different girl, different line, a little more charm, a little more vulnerability. Sometimes it works. There's a spark, a date, a hope. But too often it ends in limbo. Not rejection, not affection, just detachment. As if everyone is half there, half invested, half healed. Everyone's performing, everyone's protecting, everyone's playing. Dating becomes a performance of what we think others want, not an expression of who we are. He becomes a character, witty, masculine, but soft, confident, but safe, successful, but humble. A perfect persona, trained to be liked, until one day, he forgets how it felt to be himself. He dates, he listens, he pays. He doesn't mind the effort, but he notices something. Every time he opens up, she drifts. Every time he shares what matters, she disappears. Sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a soft, "I'm not ready right now," but it stings just the same. Beneath the silence, beneath the almosts, he's not confused. He's tired, not bitter, not angry, just exhausted. Not from trying, but from how empty trying has become. He's learned how to be interesting, how to be a good man. And still, none of it matters. He sees it in her drifting eyes, her distracted replies, in how every date feels more like an interview than a discovery. Dating today is about image, not presence. About status, not substance. Affection is a commodity. Desire is a dopamine hit. And the real man, the one who wants to build, to protect, to understand, becomes invisible. They say, be more alpha, be less nice, fix this, heal that, play better. But he already has. He's done it all, and all he found was noise. So he steps back, not out of spite, not to disappear, but because he's done performing. He doesn't announce it, he just stops, lets the app gather dust, skips the party, sits still, and let silence speak. Some call it loneliness. He calls it rest. He hasn't given up on love, just on the noise pretending to be it. Because what modern dating offers isn't intimacy. It's avoidance. In this quiet, he notices something. He no longer chases, no longer explains, not because he's bitter, but because he feels whole without being chosen. He doesn't need to be wanted to remember his worth. He walks slower, talks less, feels more, and the world keeps spinning. But he no longer chases it, because now he knows the difference between connection and performance. He still believes in love, but not the one that runs, not the one that vanishes. He believes in love that arrives in silence, that honors peace, that stays. And if that love exists, it will find him when he stops looking for it in places it never lived. There was a time he thought the problem was him, not out of self-hate, but because he'd been taught that when something doesn't work, you fix it, and if you don't fit, you adjust. So he stood in front of the mirror, not to recognize himself, but to redesign. He softened how he spoke, trimmed down his pauses, masked his intensity with irony, filtered his depth through light conversation, learned to appear relaxed, even when everything inside was trembling. 'Cause in this world, calm, performed, is often more welcome than authenticity that unsettles. He became likable, charming, interesting, the kind of man who makes a good first impression. And it worked. Doors opened, smiles stayed, talk flowed. But somewhere, always, something broke. Not in flames, not with drama, but in the quiet sigh of a well-rehearsed phrase, "I don't know, something's missing." And of course, something was missing. He was missing because in order to fit, he had slowly begun to disappear. He gave up pieces of himself in small, acceptable doses. First, the uncomfortable questions, then the quiet intensity, then his strange little passions that were too hard to explain. Bit by bit, he shaped himself into a reflection of what others hoped to see. And the more he fit in, the less he felt real. He could be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. He could be praised and still feel like an imposter. He could be desired and still feel disconnected. And that hurt more than being truly alone. Because there's no emptiness like being fully present and not being seen, speaking and not being heard, giving everything and realizing no one noticed. He remembered himself as a child, how he used to ask without fear, speak without filters, love without games. Now every word passed through 3 layers of self-editing. Every thought was pre-approved. Every emotion rationed, not for protection, but to avoid discomfort. He learned that showing too much scares people, feeling too deeply tires them, and hoping for reciprocity was dangerous, so he stopped hoping, and he stayed. But not as himself, as the version that didn't challenge, didn't ask, didn't disturb. And the more he mastered the art of being liked, the less he remembered who he was. Until one day, something broke. Not through betrayal, not through heartbreak, but through a question, simple and small, yet devastating. What do you want? And he had no idea, because he'd spent so long trying to be acceptable that he'd forgotten what he truly desired. Not what was correct, not what was expected, but what was real, the thing that burned quietly when no one else was watching. That night, he couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but because something ancient had begun to wake up. A voice that whispered, When did you stop being yourself just to be allowed to stay? And then he saw it. Fitting in has a cost, one nobody talks about. The cost isn't the failed dates, the rejection, or the wasted time. The real cost is becoming someone you don't recognize when the lights go out. So, he started taking pieces of himself back. He wrote again, even if no one would read. He walked without a destination, even if it didn't look productive. He listened to songs that made him cry. Even if it didn't look strong, he said no, even if it made him lose people. It wasn't rebellion, it was a return. He didn't stop loving. He just stopped bargaining his essence for the chance to be loved. He no longer wanted to be liked by everyone. He just wanted to be real. And if that meant losing people, so be it. Because worse than being alone is being surrounded and having to pretend. In the end, he understood something he hadn't before. Authenticity guarantees nothing except peace. And when you stop performing, you finally start to see who was really watching all along. Now he knows. Real love isn't always comfortable, but it never asks you to shrink. And anyone who only loves you when you shine is not capable to stand beside you when you tremble. That's why he no longer tries to be perfect. He just tries to be himself, even if that means being quieter, deeper, stranger, more him. Because the love that matters doesn't respond to performance. It appears when pretending ends. There comes a moment, quiet and unannounced, when the search begins to rot. Not because it lacked passion, but because the constant chasing left the soul breathless. At first, the silence feels wrong, unnatural, like something is missing, like failure is whispering behind the curtains. But it's not failure. It's the first act of rebellion. To stop, to no longer perform, to no longer reach, to no longer prove yourself worthy of being chosen. Because for so long, they believed that love must be hunted, chased like a fleeting flame, fought for earned, begged. But what if the real love wasn't running? It began when they turned off the apps, closed the tabs, walked out of rooms where their value had to be defended not in anger, but in exhaustion. They left, not because they gave up, but because something in them whispered, maybe the search is the thing keeping me lost. There were no announcements, no bold speeches, no poetic goodbyes. Just a man sitting alone on a park bench without checking his phone. Just a man driving in silence, no longer rehearsing what he'll say to impress someone. Just a man breathing, not because it leads anywhere, but because it's enough. And then the silence arrived. At first, it was unbearable, because when the external noise fades, what remains is everything you've buried. The ache of being overlooked, the embarrassment of trying too hard, the shame of always needing someone else to say, "You matter." He didn't know what to do with that silence, because without attention, without replies, without flirty texts or little validations that say you're desirable, who are you? The world never taught men how to sit still, only how to achieve, to chase, to conquer, to grind for approval, and then do it again. So when he stopped moving, everything inside him screamed, "You're disappearing." But he wasn't. He was unfolding. They thought they were empty, but they weren't. They were just overstimulated. So much noise, so much reaction, so much attention that wasn't connection. And now, with the silence pressing against their ribs, something new began to bloom. At first it was small, a breath, a stray thought, the sound of birds at 6 a.m., a memory resurfacing without shame. Then came the realization. He didn't miss the noise. He missed himself. He missed being whole without applause. He missed enjoying things without needing to post about them. He missed feeling something without explaining it. And that's when the silence became something else. A refuge. He began to see differently, not with his eyes, but with his attention. A cup of coffee felt sacred. A walk without music, healing. An afternoon without plans felt like a gift instead of a failure. And slowly, the craving for validation faded, not because he no longer wanted to be loved, but because he stopped needing to be proven lovable every single day. He stopped checking if he was attractive enough. He stopped looking for signs that he was doing it right. He stopped comparing his story to the highlight reels of strangers. Because in the quiet, he began to feel solid, real, undeniable. And here's what no one told him. Sometimes the most radical act isn't chasing what you want. It's learning to stop running and stand still long enough for it to find you. Now he sees silence not as absence, but as presence. Stillness not as weakness, but as strength refusing to perform. He used to think peace was something you found in someone else. Now he knows. Peace begins when you finally stop needing to be chosen. He didn't realize how long he'd been trying to leave himself until the day he stayed home and there was no one to impress. No messages to reply to, no one to meet, no reason to pretend he was busy, no reason to check if someone had remembered him. That morning he made coffee, not for a guest, not for a date, not for a second mug that might suggest company, just for himself. And it was strange at first, to do something kind with no audience, to pour warmth into a cup and not feel like it had to be shared to matter. But there it was, the small, subtle defiance of becoming his own companion. He sat down. He didn't check the news, didn't refresh anything, didn't scroll to numb the stillness. He just listened. And at first, he hated what he heard. Because the first sound wasn't peace, it was noise. The leftover voices from years of comparison, from endless seeking, from trying to be what others preferred. But beneath that noise, something softer waited. A quiet so old, it felt almost forgotten. The kind of silence that doesn't punish, but reveals. He had always feared being alone, because alone he might hear the truth that he was tired, that he had bent himself into too many shapes, that he missed a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. At night, he used to scroll himself to sleep, not out of boredom, but fear, because sleeping meant facing himself. And dreams, they don't lie. But now he lets the screen go dark, and in that darkness, a new kind of rest begins, not unconscious, but surrendered. He used to wake up wondering, did she text me back? Did they watch my story? Did anyone miss me? Now he wakes up and asks a different question. How do I feel today? Not, who do I need to be? Not, what should I fix? Just, what's inside me now? And that question doesn't always bring beautiful answers. Sometimes it brings grief. Sometimes it brings rage. Sometimes it brings a deep ache for something he still can't name, but he listens anyway, because for the first time in his life, he's not running from himself. He cleans the room, not because someone is coming, but because he finally believes he deserves a space that feels safe. He lights a candle, not to set the mood, but to remember that small lights still matter. He plays music, not to fill the void, but to feel what's already there. He doesn't rush to answer anymore, doesn't need to explain, doesn't try to be understood by everyone. Because the deeper he goes inward, the less approval feels like oxygen. And slowly, the home inside him starts to feel less like a cage and more like a cabin. Not perfect, not always comfortable, but finally inhabited. He once thought healing would feel like fireworks, some grand transformation, a visible before and after. But healing, he's learning, is quieter than that. It's making coffee without bitterness. It's falling asleep without needing a distraction. It's hearing his own thoughts and not recoiling. It's learning to be in your own presence and not flinch because the hardest house to live in was never someone else's expectations, never the world outside. It was always the one inside. But now, he's home. And for once, that's enough. Time doesn't ask permission. It arrives quietly, changing things without asking if you're ready. At first, it changes the body, slightly. The sharpness softens. The face holds stories it never used to. The hands feel heavier, but more certain. Then the eyes. They stop darting around for approval. They rest longer on what matters. And finally, the energy. It slows down, not out of defeat, but from understanding. There was a time he walked into a room hoping to impress. A time he adjusted his words, his posture, his tone, all for the eyes watching him. He thought presence meant performance. He thought charm was a survival skill. But time stripped all that away. Not suddenly, but over seasons. One day he simply woke up and didn't want to convince anyone anymore. He didn't lose his fire. He just stopped wasting it trying to prove it existed. Now, when he speaks, there's no effort to impress, no flair, no sales pitch, just words that land where they're meant to or don't. And that's fine too, because something happened when he stopped performing. He became real, not louder, not flashier, just undeniable. People started looking at him differently, not because he got better at being liked, but because he no longer asked for it. That shift from seeking attention to embodying peace created a silence that drew others in. He no longer enters a room like someone hoping to be noticed. He enters like someone who already knows where he stands, and somehow, without trying, he became magnetic. Not because he said the right things, but because he no longer needed to. He didn't become attractive. He became real. And real calls, not loudly, not urgently, but clearly, it's the kind of energy that doesn't beg to be chosen. It simply is. And that's enough. Now he laughs differently. He doesn't laugh to fill space. He laughs when it rises naturally, when it echoes through the ribs, not the ego. He listens differently too, not waiting for his turn to speak, but because he's genuinely curious. And when he looks at you, you feel it, not like a spotlight, but like sunlight, warm, still, undemanding. He doesn't flirt the same way. There's no chase, no pretending not to care, no performance of detachment. If he likes you, he's there, fully, but not desperately. And that presence, that complete, unapologetic presence, is rare now. Because most people are still trying to be interesting, but he just is. Not because he practiced, not because he learned the trick, but because he stopped trying to be more than he is and discovered that who he is was always enough. There's a different kind of beauty that emerges with time. It's not the kind that fades. It's the kind that was hidden beneath the roles, the insecurities, the proving. Now it's visible, not to everyone, but to those who see clearly the weight he once carried, the need to be validated, to be chosen, to be good enough. It dissolved in silence, not because someone saved him, but because he stopped asking to be rescued. And now, ironically, when he walks into the room, he's the one they notice, not because he demands it, but because he doesn't. Because he walks like someone who's not searching anymore. He walks like someone who came back home to himself. She didn't arrive with music. There were no fireworks, no cinematic signs, no moment that declared, "This is it." She simply appeared, not like a prize, not like an answer, but like a mirror he didn't know he'd been avoiding. Her presence didn't flood the room. It quieted it, not with silence, but with recognition, the kind of presence that doesn't demand attention, but anchors it, the kind that doesn't chase the spotlight, because it is light. She wasn't what he imagined. She was clearer, less polished, more human. And that's what made her so hard to look away from, because something in her rhythm matched something in his breath, not forced, not rehearsed, just true. He didn't feel that old rush, that hunger to impress, that urgency to be enough. In fact, for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to become anything he could just be. And she stayed. She wasn't looking to be saved. He wasn't looking to be completed. There was no rescuing, no roles to perform, no illusions to uphold. They weren't two halves searching for each other. They were two wholes who had stopped searching. Their connection didn't spark, it settled. Not cold, not dull, but calm, like rain tapping quietly on a roof. You don't need to chase it, you just need to be still enough to hear it. She spoke, and her voice didn't thrill him. It recognized him, not the version he showed the world, the quiet one, the one behind his eyes, the one who had stopped asking to be seen and had, because of that, finally become visible. Oh, he didn't feel chosen. He felt met, and that changed everything. Because in the past, he chased love like it was a gate he had to earn his way through. But this felt like an open path, one they could walk together, not because they needed each other to survive, but because they both knew how to walk alone. There was no grand confession, no perfect first kiss, no dramatic turning point, just two people who had stopped running from themselves long enough to recognize someone else doing the same. She didn't light him up like fire. She steadied him like earth. And that grounding, that peace, was more intimate than any storm he'd known before. There were still doubts, still shadows, but for the first time, they weren't afraid to be seen with them. He didn't hide his scars. She didn't flinch. She showed him hers. He didn't try to fix them. That was the trust, not in perfection, but in the freedom to be real without being punished for it. There were no promises about forever, only choices, repeated in small ways every day, to stay, to listen, to grow. And in those small choices, love stopped feeling like something to find. It became something to build. She wasn't the reward for his healing. She was the first person who met him after it and didn't ask him to shrink again. He didn't complete her. She didn't complete him. But they walked beside each other with eyes that no longer searched, only saw. And that's when he understood. Love isn't the end of the story. It's the moment two stories learn how to walk in rhythm. Love didn't arrive as a reward. It didn't fall from the sky because he searched harder than anyone else. It wasn't the prize at the end of a relentless pursuit. It came quietly, unexpectedly, when he finally let go. 4 years he had chased it, through apps, through texts, through glances across rooms. He had worn every version of himself he thought might be lovable. He had studied what to say, when to say it, how to hold eye contact just long enough to seem mysterious. But love, real love, never came that way. Because it wasn't hiding behind effort. It wasn't impressed by performance. It couldn't be seduced by perfect timing or clever lines. It was never waiting at the end of the chase. It was waiting at the end of himself. The moment he stopped reaching, something shifted, not outside, but within. He no longer looked for signs. He no longer asked if he was enough. He no longer stared into the crowd, hoping someone would recognize the ache in his eyes. He simply returned. Returned to the self he had left behind while chasing someone else's idea of desirable. Returned to the quiet, to the room, to the mornings where the only presence was his own. And in that stillness, a new kind of truth emerged. He was never meant to chase love. He was meant to become it. So he stopped moving, not because he gave up, but because for the first time he realized that being still was not the same as being lost. It was an invitation to let someone find him, not because he signaled louder, but because he stood exactly as he was, without reaching, without asking, without needing. He sat with himself long enough to see past the noise. He stayed in the silence long enough to hear something softer speak, that he was not incomplete, that love wasn't something to earn, that presence was the greatest offering. The journey he thought was outward was always meant to be inward. It didn't end in someone else's arms. It ended in his own chest, with both hands on his heart, finally steady. And when love did come, it didn't arrive like a savior. It didn't sweep him away. It saw him. It met him where he already was. Because real love doesn't want the version of you that's endlessly reaching. It wants the one who's already rooted. He used to believe that being loved meant being needed. Now he knows. Being loved means being seen in your stillness. And sometimes what finds you isn't looking for someone impressive. It's looking for someone real, someone who's no longer performing, someone who stayed quiet long enough to become visible. Sometimes, to be found, you must first stop searching and stay still long enough to be seen.